Good evening. My name is Ian Wardropper. I'm delighted to welcome you to a lecture in honor of one of my predecessors. The lecture is titled Charles Ryskamp, A Life in Arts and Letters. I also want to invite all of you present to join us for a reception after this lecture in honor and memory of Charles and in honor of the lecturer. And to let you know that this lecture is going to be streamed live. This is a kind of pilot program that we're trying now. So if you know somebody who wasn't able to get here to this lecture, they can simply go to our website and our homepage and click onto it right now or immediately afterwards. If you wait for a week, it will be updated with better images and PowerPoint and information. And I also just wanted to let you know that there are a whole series of lectures for the Renoir exhibition, and I hope you can look in some of our brochures and learn about those. All of those will also be streamed live. This lecture is timed to also celebrate an exhibition that just opened yesterday called A Passion for Drawings, Charles Ryskamp's Bequest to the Frick Collection. I particularly want to congratulate Katie Steiner and Nicholas Wise of our staff for having thought through and installed this exhibition on the beautiful Ryskamp blue walls. Those of you who knew Charles know that he had a particular hue which was his favorite and has been chosen for this installation to remind one of his taste. The exhibition features a group of 10 drawings from his collection which he allowed the curatorial staff of the Frick to choose. And many of his other drawings have been dispersed. Obviously, many of them are at the Morgan Library, and I won't say too much more because I'll leave this to Matthew Hargraves to speak more fully on. But this small exhibition is a kind of capsule history of Charles Ryskamp's taste. It includes some wonderful photographs of him by Beaton, Cecil Beaton, which we're delighted to have on loan to us, and a couple of cloud studies, which are by Constable, which came to us through Charles's work with a collector. It was a bequest to us that came to us because of Charles's work. So I hope you'll have a chance to see this exhibition after the lecture, and it will be up here and through April 8th. Matthew Hargraves is Associate Curator for Collections Research and Head of Collections, Information and Access at the Yale Center for British Art, where he's worked since 2005. A specialist in British art of the 18th century, he received his PhD from the Courtauld Institute in 2003 and has since published broadly on the art of the period, including a major study of Britain's first public exhibitions in the 18th century, as well as on English watercolors and on drawing practice across Europe. He worked closely with Charles Ryskamp on the exhibition Varieties of Romantic Experience, drawn from his collection, which was held at the Yale Center in 2010, bringing together 200 works on paper from the Ryskamp collection, exploring romantic drawing from a truly international perspective. Matthew is the perfect person, I think, to speak on this subject. He says there was a period in his life for 3 years when every day he had a phone call, and sometimes he thought it might be from his wife, but almost always it was from Charles Ryskamp. So this is somebody who he knew very well, and also he spoke about walking down Fifth Avenue or a street of New York with him as being a very difficult task because he was stopped by everyone on the street, so it was difficult to make progress. Charles knew so many people in the city, and not only through his years of tenure here at the Frick, but of course his long tenure at the Morgan, and all of the work that he did at Princeton, where he lived, and Yale, where he took his education. So Charles's contributions to culture, both with his eye for words, the spoken word, the written word, and for art, is extraordinary and will be celebrated and explicated by Matthew Hargraves tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, for that very kind introduction, and to everybody at the Frick for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a great honor and a great privilege to be able to talk about Charles Ryskamp for a full hour. So my talk tonight is titled Charles Ryskamp, A Life in Arts and Letters. But perhaps I should say how I came to know Charles first of all. I was privileged to work with him for several years as we planned an exhibition of more than 200 of his romantic drawings. It was an exhibition Charles had always longed to attempt, a chance to bring together his drawings from across Northern Europe to show the variety, but also the coherence of European draftsmanship in the early 19th century. Well, that exhibition opened at the Yale Center for British Art in February of 2010, but barely 2 months later, Charles had died, and the drawings in the show suddenly became a poignant temporary memorial to an extraordinary life. Happily, some of the finest drawings from his collection now find a home here at the Frick, and I must congratulate Katie Steiner and Nicholas Wise, the curators of this exhibition, on such a beautiful installation in the very space that Charles himself created to showcase drawings at the Frick. Well, I've called tonight's talk A Life in Arts and Letters, but I should confess at once that the title, Arts and Letters, is not really my own. It was Charles's, and I have taken it from perhaps the last thing he ever wrote for publication, a short reflection on his own life, which he hoped to publish with a small collection of his favorite writings. Sadly, he died before the book made it to print, and even more sadly for us, it was not a detailed memoir. Charles adamantly refused to write a memoir, despite countless pleas from friends for him to set down an account of his remarkable life. Rather than celebrate his own life and achievements, which were considerable, Charles hoped to make his final book a tribute to the friends and the mentors who had played such an important part in his own story. It was characteristically modest of Charles to focus on others rather than dwelling upon himself. And that leaves me in an awkward position tonight, for I can almost picture him sitting here with a gentle look of disapproval at the very idea of a lecture devoted entirely to himself in, of all places, the Frick, his favorite museum, which he loved to point out holds the greatest concentration of masterpieces of any museum in the world. Well, since he would not forgive me if I spoke only of him tonight, I hope you'll allow me to spend some time on the group of drawings that make up this exhibition, because for Charles, it was the drawings that mattered, not their collector. But separating a collector from his collection is no easy task, and the Ryskamp collection in particular was intensely personal, built upon countless friendships, memories, and gifts over the course of a long life. At times, he claimed to have no collection in the proper sense, just a group of what he called souvenirs of my life. So my intention then is to talk about these drawings as souvenirs, to use them as reminders of the people and places that underpinned his life in arts and letters. But let me start by saying something more general about Charles as a collector, for collecting was a lifelong passion. His first acquisition came in 1941, aged just 13, when he admired and bought 2 etchings by the American marine artist Gordon Grant. Well, these are now long since gone, but he was soon writing to auction houses, both large and small, asking for sales catalogs, to the dismay of his father, who thought it dishonest to order catalogs when he had no money to buy from them. But being from an academic family, there was no shortage of encouragement for Charles to acquire knowledge, and he was regularly dispatched to visit his uncles here in New York, where they were both professors at Columbia. And Charles immediately fell in love with this city and its great museums and libraries. But it was not until he arrived at Yale as a graduate student in 1951 that his collecting took a serious turn. Like so many of the great collectors he would later get to know, his first love was for books. A passion for English literature made him scour the latest catalogs of the book dealers, searching out important rare books and manuscripts. And only when he found himself at Cambridge University at Pembroke College in 1953 did he truly discover the visual arts, about which I'll say more shortly. His Cambridge rooms were soon decorated with a few prints, albeit prints by Dürer and Rembrandt, and he spent hours in the Fitzwilliam Museum and the print room of the British Museum, looking through box after box of prints and drawings with guidance from curatorial staff and from London art dealers. Well, close by Pembroke College and across the road from the Fitzwilliam Museum was a cluttered antique store run by Gabor Kosser, which still exists to this day. Well, the owner was an eccentric former ballet dancer, and his store presented an Aladdin's cave to the aspiring collector. And it was while browsing through the eclectic stock one day that Charles stumbled across the very first drawings he ever bought, a pair of large pen and wash drawings by Edward Lear of the Bay of Naples. Well, those Lears hung ever after above the sofa in the living room of Charles's principal residence, and you can see them there and there. But why drawings? Well, it was not just that they were more affordable than paintings. More profoundly, Charles had a lifelong love of line, and he appreciated line far more than color and form, and so his collecting naturally gravitated towards graphic art. Had money been no object, he felt, he would still have pursued prints and drawings with just as much passion. And after buying those first Lears, his collecting took off and the pace never slackened. Over time, his interests diversified. The influence of the collections of the Morgan Library, which he served as director between 1969 and 1987, encouraged him to collect continental drawings. And chronologically, the parameters of his collecting spread, so that soon he boasted a collection of drawings from the old master to the contemporary. Before long, wall space began to run out. By the end of his life, his homes in New York and Princeton were crowded with drawings hung frame to frame, sometimes floor to ceiling. Bookshelves groaned with important rare books, and the drawers of his bureaus held remarkable prints and manuscripts. When we worked together, selecting works for the Yale exhibition, he would frequently exclaim that he had just the right drawing to enhance this or that theme. And then I would be dispatched to a closet in this or that room to sort through row upon row of framed drawings stacked upright on the floor for want of space to hang them. And it was during these moments that Charles also liked to test, and I think anyone who visited his apartment was always given some such playful challenge. Bring me the drawing by this or that artist, he would say, and you'd be confronted by a wall teeming with potential candidates and the disconcerting feeling you would probably pick the wrong one. One afternoon, not long before he died, Charles was searching everywhere for a privately printed book he knew he owned but couldn't find. But in the process of searching, he discovered everything from a silk scarf by Givenchy, specially commissioned by Mrs. Paul Mellon, to the earliest surviving manuscripts of Ted Hughes, 2 poems written for Charles himself when they were students at Cambridge. And perhaps only Charles Ryskamp could have collected and given away such diverse objects as a pair of 18th century shoes to the Met, the Ted Hughes manuscripts to the Morgan, or the only drawing by William Bartram, the great American naturalist, still in private hands, given to Yale. To the uninitiated, the collection appeared an eclectic mix of the old and the new. But working with Charles and getting to know the collection, I soon discovered its remarkable coherence. It was not just that everything was a souvenir that could be tied to some moment of his life, although that was almost always true. It was instead a deep intellectual coherence based on Charles's discriminating eye and penetrating mind. He sought and found affinities where others might not notice them. And the Tiepolo drawing in this exhibition with its brown wash reminds me of a striking instance of that. Visitors to his New York apartment were confronted by the juxtaposition of his drawings alongside the large contemporary canvas of clouds above his desk, painted by his friend Dennis Stewart. But Charles saw no inconsistency or contrast in the conjunction between his drawings and the painting. As he said of Dennis Stewart's clouds, his works in my apartment are surrounded by Old Master and 19th century drawings. Together, they completely cover the walls of rooms which are decorated traditionally with 18th and 19th century furniture and objects. Dennis's swirling, sometimes turbulent paintings hold their own and seem to me quite at home in the midst of so much earlier draftsmanship. In such company, I see in his paintings a glimpse of a Tiepolo sky or a Turner seascape. Well, although Charles often talked in terms of national schools, he was no respecter of nationalities when it came to hanging his drawings. His friends and visitors were presented with a collection in no particular order, allowing Charles to delight in the unexpected juxtaposition. And he was never afraid to challenge convention in other aspects of his life. At Princeton, he introduced sherry to an evening reception for alumni, to the shock and consternation of the alumni office, but to the apparent delight of the alumni themselves. In 1969, Cecil Beaton, we saw the portrait early on, asked to take his portrait after learning that Charles had just been appointed the new director of the Morgan Library. Well, in a rash moment back at the Morgan, Charles suggested using one of the Beaton portraits in the press release announcing his appointment. Well, the very idea of a director of the Pierpont Morgan Library being photographed by the likes of Cecil Beaton was enough to almost give his assistant, a lifelong Morgan employee, a heart attack. On this occasion, he wisely retreated and sat to the Morgan's own photographer instead. Or there was the time he arrived at a party at Brooke Astor's, wearing a suit but no tie, to the great surprise of his hostess, who immediately pointed out the sartorial faux pas. He had given the tie to a struggling artist on the way to dinner, he explained to an astonished Mrs. Astor, like a latter-day Martin of Tours. And as director of the Frick, he embarked on a rehang of the collections, expanded the exhibition program, and reinvigorated the acquisitions policy. He believed passionately that no museum visitor should have to walk more than a few feet before seeing a work of art. And he believed that every visitor should have the chance to own a masterpiece, even if only in the form of a postcard. Well, that was a doctrine he learned from Kenneth Clark, Charles's ideal of the museum director, whom he first got to know at Princeton. And Charles held to this principle for the rest of his life. Socially, Charles was equally at home playing Scrabble with the Queen of the Netherlands or having lunch with a group of undergraduate students. As a professor at Princeton, he was in the habit of inviting students to his dinner parties for faculty and for friends in order to enliven the conversation. And at the Frick, he recruited a French chef and instituted the $1 lunch so that, if they were brave enough, an undergraduate student working part-time in the Frick shop could have lunch with the senior curatorial staff. In short, he was not the sort of person who felt the need to be constrained by convention. As he once put it, in Robert Frost's world, there was a road not taken. In mine, if two roads diverged in a wood, I chose, almost without thinking, to take them both. Still, there were some constraints on Charles as a collector that he couldn't so easily overcome, and Charles was always candid about those. His budget was modest, and he bought what he could afford. This meant that his collection was often changing. Sometimes many drawings would be swapped for one important drawing, or cherished drawings were sold reluctantly to pay the bills. But this circumstance only sharpened his appetite and spurred him to search out uncharacteristic works by well-known artists when he could find them, and to acquire drawings in periods that were then unfashionable, or choosing striking drawings that had no attribution at all, or were by minor figures of the period. He was eloquent on the importance of collecting as a means of training the eye, and argued that collecting was as much about hard study and connoisseurship as luck. Above all, he emphasized the thrill of collecting. This early printed notice for a discussion at his Princeton home on collecting as part of an educated man's life was characteristic of his desire to encourage others to form collections of their own. Over time, his language shifted. The hint of fustian behind calling collecting part of an educated man's life was later balanced by a more direct appeal to the pleasures of collecting, with even the occasional hint of decadence. On more than one occasion, he lamented the cost of a new acquisition, but insisted he simply had to have the drawing. And he would then give a rather arch smile and say, "You do know that some friends think I'm living much too extravagantly." He was a tireless evangelist, a great apostle of collecting. For some years in the 1970s, he taught a class at Princeton on the subject of collecting, The unconventional final paper required everyone to go out and buy a work of art. A limit of about $100 was set, and then justify the purchase to the group. And in those days, good works on paper could be acquired for very modest sums in second-floor shops on Madison Avenue. And the Princeton students were encouraged to search out hidden treasures. And I know of at least one distinguished former student who still retains and treasures that early acquisition bought for Charles's class. But aside from the financial limits on his collecting, there were other restrictions. He was a trusted advisor to many fellow collectors and would accompany them on shopping trips to dealers in New York and London. And he made it a policy never to buy for himself when accompanying a fellow collector, and he often spoke of the wonderful things he had to watch slip by on those trips. And on becoming director of the Morgan Library and then of the Frick Collection, he became careful to avoid any conflict of interest with the acquisitions policies of both museums. He turned increasingly to areas where they were not acquiring, and this meant the discovery and enthusiasm for such neglected areas as Danish art of the Romantic period. He was, with Robert Rosenblum and Kirk Varnedoe, a powerful advocate for the appreciation of Danish art in the English-speaking world. And shortly before he died in 2010, he was deeply gratified to learn that the National Gallery in London was mounting an exhibition of the work of the great Danish artist Christian Kubke. He felt that others were finally discovering this extraordinary field. The exhibition opened just a week before he died. Well, many of his great drawings were the gifts of devoted and admiring friends. Mostly, he was happy to divulge the identities of these generous benefactors. At other times, he was inclined to be coy. I recall discussing an exceptionally rare print that he had owned and then given to the Morgan Library. After discussing the print with him for a while, I couldn't resist asking how on earth he had managed to acquire this print while still an assistant professor at Princeton. "It was given to me," he said, with a twinkle in his eye that prompted me to ask, "By whom?" "I'm not telling," he replied with a smile. "You'll have to go look it up." Well, after retirement in 1997, Charles was freed from worrying about conflicts of interest and, somewhat to his surprise, found himself reverting to his earliest tastes, British art of the 18th century and the Romantic period. And the exceptional Stubbs drawing of Warren Hastings in this exhibition, acquired shortly after retirement, is a good example of that return to his first interests. During retirement, his pace of life never slackened, and the collecting never abated. No trip to London, Paris, or Hamburg was complete without a circuit of the dealers with whom he had become such close friends, even if he only had time for hurried visits on the way to the airport with a taxi kept waiting outside. His New York friends were visited almost daily. Consequently, this exhibition includes drawings he lived with over the course of many years, as well as those more recently acquired, such as the graphite landscape by Theodore Rousseau. It was hard to keep up. When working on the Romantic Drawings exhibition for Yale, we added a good number of newly acquired drawings to the book when it was well into the proof stages, and even one or two onto the walls of the exhibition a couple of weeks after the show had opened. My last conversation with Charles was by telephone in early March of 2010 when, unbeknownst to me, he was already in the final stages of the cancer that would finally carry him off. He talked excitedly of an exceptionally rare book he hoped to acquire in New York, and asked whether it would be possible to add it to the exhibition. It was typical of Charles's infectious and irrepressible enthusiasm and sheer delight in collecting. Were there disappointments? Well, he certainly always longed to own a fine drawing by Rembrandt, but they always seemed to be beyond his means. And then in 2009, a Rembrandt was finally offered to him. It was expensive, and to afford it, he would have needed to trade a good number of other drawings. But when the transparency arrived for his scrutiny, to his immense disappointment, the drawing turned out to be a caricature study that he felt he simply couldn't live with. But the disappointment did not last long, and he consoled himself instead with a fabulous early drawing by Christopher Eckersberg, the great Danish artist. But I promised to spend time talking about the drawings as well as their collector. Charles's unfinished book that I mentioned at the start was not about himself, but a tribute to the numerous people who had a profound influence on his life, especially his passionate collecting. He wrote, "I have been very, very fortunate in my friends and mentors. There have been so many, and they were truly remarkable persons. My life would have been totally different without them. So I would now like to look at the drawings as souvenirs, and in doing so, shed some further light on Charles as a collector, and on some of the figures who played such a prominent role in his life. Well, there could be no better place to start than with the marvelous and exceedingly rare drawing by George Stubbs, a perfect instance of Charles's ability to find the rarest drawings by celebrated artists. Stubbs was not a prolific watercolorist by any means, and typically reserved the medium for preparatory purposes. Several such drawings were mentioned in his studio sale, but this seems to be a unique survival. In this case, the small watercolor represents Warren Hastings, and was perhaps a preparatory study for Stubbs's equestrian portrait of Hastings on his Arabian horse, which is still in a private collection. The sitter had been Governor-General of Bengal from 1774 until 1785, but was forced into retirement through poor health and accusations of corruption. Returning to England, he settled on an estate at Dalesford in Worcestershire and remained there for the rest of his life, living in high style. The timing of this penetrating portrait was significant. The allegations of corruption had grown, and Hastings was mired in a sensational impeachment trial, which began in May 1787 and was not concluded until his acquittal in 1795. His private secretary, George Nesbitt Thompson, had written to Hastings while Stubbs was working on the portrait, urging him to, quote, "give the artist one more sitting as soon as you return to London, and before your countenance has fallen with the abominations of that vile place Westminster." So Stubbs's watercolor was probably made during just such a sitting, and Stubbs captures the wounded but dignified countenance of Hastings as he endures his very public ordeal. The delicate hatching seems to cut away extraneous detail to reveal the very soul of the sitter, his fortitude suggested by the unsmiling face and the skin pulled tightly over his skull. And that tendency to cut away surfaces was surely informed by Stubbs's early work as an anatomist and his self-training in engraving. His own self-portraits show him holding his brushes with the precision and action of a surgeon's scalpel, and in whatever medium he worked, he was forever tending to pare away, just as his celebrated Anatomy of the Horse, this is one of the early plates, were arranged in a way to show the layers of the horse gradually stripped away until nothing but the skeleton remains. It's the same approach that underlies his drawing of Hastings, and it was something that long fascinated Charles. His earliest memory was of leafing through a copy of Stubbs's Anatomy of the Horse in his grandfather's house in Grand Rapids, and his first published book, a study of the poet William Cowper, included new research on Warren Hastings and on his famous trial. Well, Charles's work on Cowper and Hastings stemmed from his time at Yale, where he studied 18th century literature alongside Harold Bloom under the tutelage of the great Boswell scholar, Professor Frederick Pottle. But it was his work with his earliest mentor at Yale, Wilmarth Sheldon Lewis, that had the greatest impact on his subsequent career. Mr. Lewis was a Yale trustee and a great book collector. At his home in Farmington, he had assembled the world's most important collection of material relating to Horace Walpole and his house, Strawberry Hill, what would eventually become the Lewis Walpole Library of Yale University. The story of how Charles eventually was introduced to Mr. Lewis was one of his great set-piece stories, which he relished telling and retelling, and which never lost its humor. It happened like this. Charles found himself a graduate student at Yale without private means and was forced to contemplate selling some of his rare book collection to cover his expenses. Now, at that time, Professor Tinker, a formidable Yale institution, was serving as both professor of English and as keeper of rare books. Well, he knew the young Charles had a fine collection of books, and one day asked Charles to give the Yale Library a particularly rare volume which Charles had been discriminating and lucky enough to acquire. Charles refused, insisting he couldn't afford to give it away. Tinker was aghast. Worse still, Tinker listened in mounting horror as Charles went on to say that he would soon be taking a job, and not just any job, but a job as the soda jerk at the drugstore on New Haven's Broadway. Well, utterly dumbfounded at the idea of a Yale student needing a job, Tinker threw Charles out of his office in an apoplectic rage. But within an hour, Charles was summoned back and instructed to decline the job as soda jerk immediately. Instead, he was told to meet Mr. Lewis for lunch the following week, where, Tinker said ominously, "We shall then decide upon your future." Well, the lunch was a great success, and Charles soon found himself assisting in the editorial office on the gargantuan project to publish the correspondence of Horace Walpole, later becoming a trusted research aide to Mr. Lewis at his homes in Farmington, Connecticut, and in Newport, Rhode Island. Mr. Lewis went to Newport to work, and it was only with the greatest reluctance that he permitted Charles to take time off to sit on the beach. But it was a lifelong scholarly friendship, and after Mr. Lewis's death, Charles became a founding member of the board of managers of the newly formed Lewis Walpole Library, and served on the board until his own death in 2010, a fitting mark of devotion to his mentor. As Charles himself put it, quote, "While working with Mr. Lewis, I learned the rules of elegant scholarship. I learned to select, omit, throw away. Above all, I saw how important it was to have a vision of scholarship beyond the more immediate goals of teaching and publishing." Well, it was a formative influence that shaped the course of Charles's life as a scholar and collector. Mr. Lewis once remarked, "It doesn't matter what you collect as long as you do it passionately." Well, that was certainly true of Charles. But Charles's time at Yale had not always been so happy. As a master's student, he had somehow found himself mired in classes for which he felt ill-equipped and little inclined, Old Norse and early Germanic literature being chief among them. He would work until the early hours of the morning, reading untranslated and obscure epics set in heavy Gothic typefaces, and he struggled desperately, pleaded to be excused the class, felt he didn't belong at Yale, and longed for a way out. So it's ironic that the brilliant Fuseli double-sided drawing in this exhibition should illustrate an episode from perhaps the greatest of all such epics, the Germanic Nibelungenlied, the tale of a hero named Siegfried, and later the basis of Wagner's Ring Cycle. Well, the epic was based on early Norse sagas circulating before the end of the 6th century, but was not written down until about 1200 in Austria. The text was then lost, but rediscovered in 1755 by Fuseli's friend, Johann Bodmer, who published a new edition in 1757. It attracted little interest until Napoleon suddenly invaded the German principalities in 1803, when the epic became a bold expression of German resistance to the cultural and military supremacy of France. Fuseli was the first artist to illustrate the poem, and the subject of this drawing has been identified as Siegfried battling the dragon. A dragon, lurking in a tree, has attacked Siegfried by coiling itself around the hero's horse. Siegfried, thrown to the ground, wrestles the dragon's tail to prevent it from overpowering him. It's fanciful, perhaps, but I cannot help seeing the struggling hero as a portrait of the young Charles grappling with his Old Norse and Germanic poetry in the early hours of the morning. Still, I should note that it was not all struggle at Yale. An essay he wrote on the New England sources of Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter was written while he was still a graduate student, and with the encouragement of friends, he finally published it some years later in 1959. To his eternal surprise, it proved to be the most popular thing he ever wrote, and it has since been translated into countless languages. He would be amused to learn that it is now used as an exemplary text in the latest edition of a book called The Complete Idiot's Guide to Writing Well. But at the time, Charles longed for a change of scene, and he jumped at the chance to study English literature at Cambridge in 1953. Well, some of his Yale professors immediately expressed their disapproval. They thought Cambridge was a rather frivolous place to study compared to Yale, but seeing his determination to go to Cambridge, they did their best to salvage what they could of his education. They urged Charles to rent a challengingly Spartan cold water flat in Bloomsbury and devote as much of his time as possible to studying in the British Library. Well, some of this Charles did, and he soon found he was spending more time in the British Library and the print rooms of the British Museum and the Fitzwilliam Museum than in the lecture halls of Cambridge. And it was during his time at Cambridge that he began collecting drawings and also formed many important friendships. In the afternoon, he would take tea with the aging E.M. Forster, and then in the evenings, spent his time with the young Ted Hughes, then a fellow student at Pembroke College, who occupied the same rooms that Edmund Spenser had in the 16th century. Charles also got to know the family of the Duke of Buccleuch, the owner of the greatest collections of any family in Britain, in more than a dozen great houses. There were days spent at Boughton, England's Versailles, getting to know its princely holdings of paintings and decorative arts, and, on one hair-raising occasion, being summoned at the last minute to lead a tour of the outstanding early silver collection for a group of senior curators from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And then there were stays with the family in Scotland, traveling between the various family seats. Here he had the chance to study a princely collection at first hand. Well, the greatest painting in the Buccleuch collection is Leonardo's Madonna of the Yarn Winder, and by family tradition, the painting moved from house to house with them. In the 1950s, it had its own box for safekeeping while in transit, and it was Charles's responsibility to carry it safely from house to house each time it moved, sitting in the passenger seat of a car driven by one of the nannies and with a pack of spaniels on the back seat. Well, I cannot help but think that the Landseer drawing of otterhounds running free in Scotland appealed to Charles in part because of those early and improbable experiences in Scotland. And he was particularly proud of this drawing. I remember us visiting a dealer in New York who happened to have a good selection of Landseer drawings. Well, they were marvelous, but none moved Charles quite as much as his own. As a drawing, it relates to those vast Scottish hunting scenes that Landseer made in emulation of Rubens. But what Charles appreciated most was the fact the otterhounds here were shown alone, entirely devoid of human contact, running free as if in a state of nature. But at Cambridge, it was another figure who proved to be the seminal influence on the young Charles, Sir Geoffrey Keynes, a surgeon, scholar, and the younger brother of the economist John Maynard Keynes. Charles later paid handsome tribute to Sir Geoffrey, stating that he, quote, shaped my life as a collector and a builder of public collections. He did more than anyone in making collecting a central fact of my life, both art and literature. Charles knew the reputation of Sir Geoffrey Keynes as a Blake scholar and of his famed library at Lammas House long before he arrived at Cambridge. Lammas House stands in the village of Brinkley, about 12 miles from Cambridge, and almost as soon as he arrived, Charles wrote asking for permission to consult the rare books in the library. When an invitation duly followed, Charles procured a bicycle and pedaled off for the 12-mile ride to Lammas House, where he arrived utterly exhausted, but Geoffrey Keynes welcomed him into the great library and introduced him to his rare editions of Blake, as well as his northern prints, including those by Bruegel the Elder. And later that day, his wife, Margaret Darwin, looked in, expecting to find the usual dull and aged scholar from Cambridge. "But you don't have a long beard," she exclaimed upon seeing the handsome young student. And that was that. Charles became a firm fixture with the Keynes family, and the poetry and art of William Blake became a lifelong passion which, as we shall see, was to open further doors in the future. Well, through good fortune and the gifts of friends, Charles gradually built up an exceptional collection of Blake drawings, prints, books, and manuscripts. So it's particularly fitting that a drawing by Blake should now find a home here at the Frick in the form of a visionary head of the Welsh warrior Owen Glendower, who fought against Henry IV of England in the early 15th century. The oddity of these fantastical visionary heads held a great appeal to Charles. Blake began making them in 1819 on evening visits to his friend John Varley, an artist turned astrologer. And in the early hours of the morning, Varley would begin urging Blake to conjure particular apparitions, and Blake would then sit drawing their portraits as if they were seated in front of him. The apparitions ranged widely from actual historical figures, like Owen Glendower, to the fantastical ghost of a flea. But were these a light-hearted parlor game, or a more serious exploration of the realms of history and the imagination? No one quite agrees, but they are part and parcel of Blake's exalted world of the imagination, which for him was superior to the material world. If we were all not so enslaved to the material world, to pride, to vanity and money, he argued, we too would see into the world of the imagination and glimpse figures like Owen Glendower. But Blake's vision of Glendower was also determined in part by his literary enthusiasm. Above all, Shakespeare's description of the irregular and wild Glendower from Henry IV, Part 1. For Charles, Blake was the great exponent of his two chief passions, art and letters. And it was through Blake that Charles forged some of his most treasured friendships. After returning from Cambridge, Charles completed the doctorate at Yale, and in 1955 began to teach at Princeton. He was soon introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Gerard Lambert, and a shared passion for Blake ignited a friendship between them and the young academic. This drawing of Owen Glendower was the gift of Mrs. Lambert, as were a number of other Blake prints and drawings in Charles's collection. But there was another gift from the Lamberts, which was to have so decisive an impact on Charles as a collector: the introduction to Mr. and Mrs. Paul Mellon. In 1948, Rachel Lambert had married Paul Mellon, and when Charles first met them in the late 1950s, he was living just across the field from the Lamberts. At that time, Paul Mellon was still primarily a book collector, but he was just beginning to embark on collecting British art with enthusiasm, beginning with sporting art and then spreading out to build the most comprehensive collection of its type outside Britain. For Paul Mellon, as for Charles, William Blake's work as a poet and a visual artist helped bridge the gap between arts and letters, and they became close friends through a shared enthusiasm for Blake. Charles spent every August for many years with the Mellons at their home on Cape Cod and enjoyed countless evenings at their Manhattan home. It was not at all like the relationship Charles had with his other great friend and mentor, Mr. Lewis. With Mr. Lewis, study was paramount, and it was with considerable reluctance, as I said, that he ever let Charles disappear off to the beach during their summers at Newport. But with Paul Mellon, things were different. As Charles put it, quote, "Our time together did not result as much in study, research, and writing as in enjoyment of books, art, horses, and country and sea life." And already one detects that shift in Charles's attitudes towards the sheer pleasure and enjoyment of collecting. There were daily excursions on the Mellon yacht, with the time spent naming the new yearlings bred at Mr. Mellon's Virginia stud. And the challenge was to find names that showed each horse's bloodline, as well as reflecting Paul Mellon's life and interests, causing them to frequently go aground, apparently. Arts and Letters was, in fact, a name given to a great Mellon horse on just one of those sailing trips. And Charles would also accompany Paul Mellon on regular visits to the dealers in London. A particular favorite of both was William Drummond, who always had what were, for Charles, affordable drawings, and he was often forced to watch Paul Mellon purchase things he would dearly have loved for himself. But the value of their friendship more than compensated for any disappointment. Charles was always at pains to point out that the Mellons shaped not just his taste, but the taste of an entire generation. Mrs. Mellon's own taste, so famous and still so influential, was for French art and culture, as well as botanical art and garden history. A renowned gardener in her own right, Mrs. Mellon designed the Rose Garden at the White House in 1961 during the Kennedy administration. A less well-known work was the garden of Charles's own house at Princeton, a two-story cottage on Cleveland Lane named Box Stall. Over time, Charles himself gathered a distinguished collection of botanical drawings, and this sensational watercolor of roses by Pierre-Joseph Redoute, speaks so strongly of that relationship with the Mellons, so crucial to his life. It's a drawing that's been reproduced probably more than any other in the Ryskamp collection. And usually Charles tended to give such prominent or popular drawings straight to public institutions. He felt they were too important to be in private hands and should be more accessible to scholars. But in this case, Charles kept the drawing to the very end. While he had good reason to be proud of it, by the close of the 18th century, Redoute had emerged as the most prolific and celebrated botanical artist of his day. His plant studies, made in the Royal Botanical Gardens in Paris in the early 1780s, quickly attracted notice from the leading French botanists and helped secure him the position of draftsman to Marie Antoinette. True, this was not the most auspicious time to begin working for the French crown, but Redoute moved with apparent ease through the turmoil of the French Revolution. His art was in constant demand among French botanists and plantsmen, and his immense prestige as an illustrator secured him the patronage of Empress Josephine once Napoleon had assumed power. Charles's drawing of two different types of plums was likely one of the watercolors made for Josephine's publications between 1802 and 1817, which focused on her own botanical collections at Malmaison. And while the drawing necessarily provides detailed botanical information, Redoute indulged himself by including the bravura drops of dew, one of which is caught in motion as it slides down the plum like a tear. The drawing was also one of the few in Charles's collection executed on vellum, a calfskin support usually reserved for the most elite patrons because of its cost. But the results were always far superior to drawings on paper because vellum could be polished smooth, allowing for exceptional detail and luminosity. Well, the Mellons also shaped Charles's tastes in another important way. He repeatedly stressed that it was because of the Mellons that he had learned to admire small works of art. He loved Paul Mellon's study in his Manhattan house more than any other interior, its walls and surfaces crowded with small paintings and drawings. And he admired the ingenious solutions that Mrs. Mellon devised to display clusters of small drawings and paintings on colored boards to prevent them being lost on vast expanses of wall. Charles's own apartments were gradually crowded with small gems on tables, desks, shelves, and screens. A Blake print here, given by Sir Geoffrey Keynes, a rare German landscape there, and the Delacroix study of a Moroccan interior included in this exhibition. It is a record of perhaps the most important event in Delacroix's life, the journey to North Africa at the very start of 1832 in the company of a diplomatic team led by the Comte de Mornay. By February, Delacroix was in Morocco and had become entranced by Moorish architecture. He had no access to most interiors in the Islamic State because of his Christianity, but an embassy employee arranged for him to visit Jewish homes, and this interior is almost certainly one of those. For Charles, this small study was not merely descriptive, but opened up a hidden world, becoming a metaphor for the artist's life that was so crucial an idea to Romanticism. So a fondness for the romantic world of the imagination allowed Charles to shift easily from Blake's visionary heads to Delacroix's little interior. He loved Delacroix intensely for being the finest exponent of that agonistic strand of Romanticism that held an appeal to him. On only my second visit to his New York apartment, he told me to open a large envelope that had just arrived in the mail. And inside was a late Delacroix drawing of a lion hunt, a riot of arms, legs, claws, and teeth. He had long dreamed of owning such a drawing and couldn't believe his luck. And not long before he died, he traveled to Paris for an opening at the Musée Delacroix, located in the great painter's house on the Rue du Furstenberg, and complete with a dinner in the studio. The thrill of that opportunity to enter the inner sanctum of Delacroix was palpable in Charles's conversation. The little Delacroix drawing had an added appeal. It had once belonged to Degas, part of Degas' remarkable collection of works on paper. Pondering exalted provenance of this kind had once prompted a discussion between us on the ethics of the collector's stamp. Had he ever used one? I asked. No, said Charles. Not ever? No, it's not something I approve of. But in a flash he added mischievously that he would suspend his disapproval to own a drawing stamped by a great collector like a Padre Resta or a Mariette or a Degas. And to signal the relationship between Degas and Delacroix, Charles hung the little Delacroix right above the early figure study by Degas, now here at the Frick. And there's two of them there. The Degas probably dates to the mid or late 1850s, when the young artist was toiling away in the Louvre on the advice of Ingres himself. In later life, Degas told the story of his youthful visit to Ingres' studio. After showing his portfolio to the great neoclassicist, he received some unexpected advice. Young man, Ingres said, never draw from nature, always from memory or after prints of the masters. So it was that in April 1853, Degas had registered to copy old masters in the Louvre and from prints in the Bibliothèque Impériale, and this figure, clutching his sword, may well have been copied from another work of art, perhaps from a sculpture or a print. And the small detail of the muscles of the thigh, in the top left corner, drawn presumably with the aid of an anatomical book, or even from an actual demonstration, already points to the vigorous probing of the visible world that would prove the hallmark of so much of Degas' later draftsmanship. Its presence in the collection also points to Charles's years as director of the Morgan Library, where, by his own admission, exposure to the range of the Morgan's treasures opened his eyes to the possibilities of collecting beyond the parameters of British art and literature. And while it's easy enough to talk about Charles's impact on the institutions he led with such distinction, it's also worth remembering the impact of those institutions on him and on his collecting habits. A large historical drawing of figures, such as David Wilkie's Burial of the Scottish Regalia, is so unusual in Charles's collection that I think it can only properly be explained by thinking about his time as director of the Frick. As he once said of his own taste, I do have some peculiarities of taste and bias. Portraits and landscapes fascinated me more than historical, mythological, or religious compositions. But this major historical drawing, albeit a study, had a prized place in the collection. I mentioned earlier that however much Charles talked about the French or the Dutch or British drawings, he almost never respected these distinctions when it came to hanging them. His approach was to juxtapose works, to draw out connections, whether formal or conceptual, sometimes accidental, sometimes deliberate, in order to challenge and delight himself and his visitors, to look afresh at his drawings and at the creative impulses that inspired them. Charles took great delight in discovering David Wilkie's bold expression of internationalism, which seemed to confirm what he had believed for so long. In an 1824 letter to the director of the French Royal Museums, Wilkie declined an invitation to exhibit in the upcoming salon, but he warmly welcomed the offer nonetheless. He said, quote, "It is time to show that the arts are cosmopolitan and that all national prejudice is foreign to them." Unquestionably, Charles's decade as director of the Frick sharpened his own thinking on this matter. It deepened his appreciation for the complex relationships between artists in their own time and across the centuries. His decision to rehang parts of the Frick collection was part of that vision, shaking up the collection to draw out affinities and connections between artists from different schools in different times, and to challenge visitors to think anew about familiar and beloved works of art. Working daily with outstanding Dutch and Flemish paintings, especially those by Rembrandt, clearly shaped his own collecting. Rembrandt drawings remained well beyond his grasp, but Wilkie's study of the 1832 history painting, inspired by Rembrandt, offered an entirely new dimension to Charles's romantic holdings. Two surviving oil sketches, one of which was owned by Charles's great friend and fellow collector Eugene Thor, revealed the Rembrandt debt even more clearly. The subject captured a dramatic moment in Scottish history. In 1651, the armies of Royalist Scotland and Republican England had clashed at Dunbar, with the victory going to the English commanded by Oliver Cromwell. The defeated Scots feared the destruction of the Scottish coronation regalia and hurriedly buried them in the floor of the parish church at Kinneff. Although the regalia were unearthed in 1660, the scene shown here being retrieved from the floor, they were returned to Edinburgh Castle, but they were soon unaccountably misplaced until Sir Walter Scott led a campaign for their recovery in 1818. While Scott's gesture of recovering this coronation regalia was symbolic, Britain had only 3 years earlier defeated Napoleon's armies at Waterloo and temporarily halted the spread of revolution that had hung over Europe since 1789. By 1832, when Wilkie tackled this subject in honor of Walter Scott, Britain ruled supreme. It was an age of Anglomania, when British art was highly esteemed in France. Artists like Géricault and Delacroix crossed the Channel to learn the secrets of what they called British colour and effect. Géricault had praised Wilkie warmly during his visit to London in 1820 and 1821, and wrote home to his French colleagues, urging them to be, quote, steeped in the English school, since colour and effect are understood and felt only here. In Wilkie's drawing, boldness of colour, inspired by the Dutch and Flemish Baroque, triumphs over neoclassical line. And although admiration for Wilkie on the continent was almost exclusively based on his drawings and prints rather than his paintings, that did not prevent him from being nominated a corresponding member of the Institut de France in 1836 and a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor in 1841, both unthinkable honors for a British artist at the beginning of the 19th century. It was that unexpected moment of Anglo-French artistic dialogue that so appealed to Charles. And had he lived, he planned to work with Yale students on a small exhibition devoted to British artists in Paris in the Revolutionary and Romantic era, drawing entirely on the collection of Paul Mellon. Well, of all the British artists received most warmly in France, none is more famous than John Constable. The exhibition of his Haywain in the Paris Salon of 1824 marked the moment when British art was seriously re-evaluated in France. And again, the Frick collection played a profound role in Charles's development as a collector. Great works by Constable had long been available to him in the collections of Paul Mellon, and that little office in the Mellon House in New York that we saw earlier, Charles's favorite interior, was crowded with his small cloud and landscape studies. But here at the Frick, Charles could work with exceptional French paintings alongside outstanding pictures by Constable, and that sharpened his appreciation for the way in which British and French landscape painters emulated each other. He could quote passages from Constable's letters with ease and would invoke them at opportune moments to show parallels in the way that a Dutch or a Danish or a French artist approached nature. But of all those European followers of Constable, it was Theodore Rousseau that intrigued him most. Rousseau was the most celebrated of the Barbizon painters to respond to the challenge of Constable in the 1820s. And like Constable, he turned his attention from the idealized classical landscapes and heroic scenes of his forebears to focus instead on common nature and the local landscape. Sketching outdoors in graphite became fundamental to his routine, and this wonderful drawing of a woodland pool, which Charles acquired late in 2009, is a perfect example of this approach. Charles always felt that Rousseau, along with Daubigny and Corot, were crucial to the formation of American taste, given their appeal to Gilded Age collectors like Henry Clay Frick or to Andrew Mellon. But more importantly, he was the artist who, perhaps above all others, expressed for Charles a sense of man and nature as one. As he put it, quote, "I collected romantic drawings because they made me happy and often pictured man and nature in rapport." And it was that rapport between man and nature, the serene rather than the agonistic side of Romanticism, that delighted him most. And he and Rousseau both shared an uncommon passion for trees that bordered on the obsessive. Charles's collection abounded in tree studies, from the most flourishing tree to the shattered tree stump. And just a year before making this drawing, Rousseau had famously petitioned Napoleon III to stop the widespread destruction of ancient woodland trees in the suburbs of Paris and created a preservation for their protection. At times, Rousseau even longed to become like a tree in order to observe and to capture the secret life of nature. He said, "When I'm in my observatory, I dare not move because silence reveals the heart of things. The woods begin to stir. Silence has allowed me, as I stood as still as a tree trunk, to witness a deer in his dwelling and at his toilet. He who lives in silence becomes the center of the world." I think that alone captures Rousseau's deep appeal for Charles, one of those late Romantic artists who represented the serene communion with nature. And Charles exuded serenity in abundance, even when his final years were increasingly marked by pain and lack of mobility, and even during those last months when he must have known but did not acknowledge that his life was drawing to a close. And it was the tree that was to be his final emblem. During our last day together in New Haven, he talked excitedly of future projects, but also of a recent visit to the John Stevens shop on Rhode Island, the outstanding stone-cutting firm that Charles had known for decades and promoted with great enthusiasm among his friends. He told me he had just commissioned Nick Benson to carve his own gravestone, with a roundel of oak leaves and acorns, but with one acorn already fallen to the ground to become a new tree. There it is. At that time, I had no inkling that he would die so soon. He seemed so full of life and enthusiasm, and I will never forget my last glimpse of him. I left him sitting in the print room at the Yale Center, poring over drawings from the Paul Mellon collection that had somehow escaped his notice before. And that is exactly how he'd want to be remembered. Charles never explained what that beautiful design of oak leaves meant to him, but I'd like to think that the fallen acorn represents anyone who ever visited the Morgan or the Frick during his tenure and went away more curious about art and artists, more enthused by the great works of literature, and above all, inspired to take up collecting as a result of Charles's own scholarship, teaching, collecting, and diligent stewardship of two of the greatest museums in the world. That, to me, is the legacy of Charles's extraordinary life in arts and letters, and, I hope, the fitting result of this wonderful exhibition. Thank you. think, do we have time for questions? If there, no? Yes?
Can you tell us more about his parents?
I'm sorry?
Can you tell us something more about his parents?
His parents. He came from an academic family. His father was a professor in Grand Rapids, and I think a school administrator as well. His mother, he was devoted to, and the color, which Ian mentioned at the beginning, that Ryskamp blue, actually brings up a great story about his time at the Frick. And it was a color that Charles used throughout his life in his apartments. And it was a color that his mother had devised. And one year, she had decided to completely repaint their home in Grand Rapids. And she had devised this wonderful blue color. And it was while he was director here at the Frick that someone said to him, well, what do you call this blue? And he said, well, it's Ryskamp blue. And they said, well, it's a bit arrogant, isn't it? He said, well, it's not for me, it's for my mother. So it was a color that meant a great deal to him and reminded him of his certainly his mother. So his parents were, crucial influence on him. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.